Felipe Martins de nuevo para exponer un paper de Elvio Acinelli, colega de San Luis Potosí, de la Universidad de Potosí, titulado ¿Quién controla al controlador? Es un modelo dinámico de corrupción. Muchas gracias, Martins, colega de la Universidade do Porto, también Portugal. Gracias.
So I will be substituting Elvio Acinelli, who couldn't come today to present this work. It's a joint work with Jorge Oviedo, Alberto Pinto, and Luís Quintas. So I will start with some motivations for our work. Then I will describe our model. I will describe what we call corruption social trap, and then I will introduce the dynamics to describe the evolution of corruption, and I will finish with some conclusions. First about the motivations, why to study the phenomenon of corruption. The first one of the things that we found was European Union, that in 2014 the European Union published their first ever anti-corruption report, and they concluded that corruption and corrupt acts cost the EU economy a large amount of money. This is the first motivation to study corruption. The second is that there is also a lot of empirical as well as theoretical evidence that shows that high and rising corruption increases income inequality and increases poverty levels in countries. Now, a slight description of our approach is the following. In most of the current literature about corruption, it is considered that the central authority must play a role to stop and to control corruption. And we call that central authority, for simplicity, we call it the government. But many times, the individuals that are members of the political elites, they may benefit from the evolution of corruption. So we have the government as a first level, we have the officials in the second level. The officials might have an incentive to corrupt acts, and the government must control the officials. So the reason why we call this work Who Controls the Controller is the fact that the government must control the acts of the officials, but who will control the government? That's why we call the work this way. The quote is from Latin, is from Juvenal, in a different context, but it appears in one famous satire written in the Antiquity. And the answer to this question in our work is that the controller is the government, and who will control the controller? It is the citizens with the voting power and democracy. So now the description of the model. We start by considering a society where there is a central authority that is elected by universal suffrage by citizens. We call it the government, and it must assign public officials to serve the citizens when they require governmental services. And in their turn, the officials, they have two different behaviors, two different pure state strategies, that is to fulfill their role properly or not fulfill their role. The first one is an honest strategy. The second one is a dishonest. For instance, it may be the official collects a certain amount of money and from the citizen, and after that he fulfills its role. Now, a general description of corruption that is found in theoretical and social sciences works is like this. Corruption can be defined as the misuse of public power for private benefit. For instance, the government officials, they collect bribes. as I've described in the previous line, government corruption may be seen as complicity of the government with those officials that sell government property, in state property in a certain way for personal gain, and a complicity with some economic elites. And sometimes a dishonest official may be colluded with a corrupt central authority, and both take advantage of that behavior. So in the same way, the central authority or government also has two pure strategies: to be corrupt or not to be corrupt. So we have 4 pure strategies: 2 for the officials, 2 for the central authority or government, and then there is also an intervention of the third population, that is not officials and is not government, that is the citizens. They must choose between to re-elect the government or not. It is not necessary to think about re-election. We may think in a broader sense of keeping the government in power, manifesting against the government or not. But our main focus would be on re-election, but it is not the unique interpretation for this. The citizens would prefer a non-corrupt government, but they do not have complete information about the behavior of the government. Their information is given by the contact that in the interaction citizens have with officials. If the citizens perceive a great number of corrupt officials, then the probability that they will vote against the government is higher. I will describe this a little bit better after some slides. So we introduce a game between that has the following payoff matrix. The government has 2 poor strategies, the officials have 2 poor strategies, and we have some quantities of the model. By W, we denote the wage that the officials are paid by the government. By M, we denote the fine that the honest government imposes on a dishonest official. By MC is the value of a bribe that is taken by a dishonest official from a citizen. By MG, we denote the amount that a dishonest official must pay to his part in the government when a collusion occurs, so corrupt government and corrupt official, and both of them are corrupt. It may be seen, for instance, as a fraction of the bribe MC that was taken by the official previously. MG prime is the amount that an honest official must pay to a dishonest government to keep her position, or for instance, because they do not want to be punished for breaching the rules of coexistence between government and officials. And E is an efficiency cost that we associate with a capture of a corrupt official by a non-corrupt government. And it is a measure of governmental efficiency in the fight against corruption. And then we have the intervention of citizens in 2 variables, VGC and VGNC, which are 2 random variables that correspond to the value that a corrupt and non-corrupt government assign to be maintained in power for the next period. This may be seen as an election, for instance. So this is why the interpretation is not unique. And we compute the expected values that are the values of those variables multiplied by the probability that the government is maintained, that the corrupt government and a non-corrupt government are maintained in power. So we symbolize, those are the probabilities that the government, corrupt and non-corrupt respectively, are maintained in power. This may be seen as re-election odds for the governments, but again the interpretation is not unique. They may be seen as a kind of popularity measure about a corrupt government and about the non-corrupt government. So kind of popularity perception about the government that will change the values of the expected values for those variables, and they will have an important intervention on the results of the model. In a certain way, these strategies are these probabilities are more or less maybe seen as mixed strategies of the citizens. We also introduced the index of intolerance to corruption, the difference between the probability that a non-corrupt government is maintained in power and the same probability for a corrupt government. And this index captures the social sensibility to corruption. Recall that when the number of corrupt officials increases, then those probabilities they decrease, because that's why the citizens have incomplete information. We also assume that when the number of corrupt officials increases, the index of intolerance increases. It means that the citizens have not complete information, but they somehow are able to distinguish between a non-corrupt government and a corrupt government. It means that the derivative of the index of intolerance with respect to the number of corrupt officials is an increasing function. When the number of corrupt officials increases, the intolerance increases as well. As usual, we compute the expected payoffs for each one of the strategies, and we denote by we will assume in the remainder of this work that the total amount of officials is fixed, but the distribution may change a long time. We'll see it after when we consider dynamics for this model. So our first proposition is that it's the relation between the number of corrupt officials and the government corruption. Officials prefer to choose a dishonest behavior if and only if the government corruption is large enough, and the converse, and a high number of corrupt officials encourages government corruption. So in less words, this may be seen as saying that corruption is a mechanism that is self-enforcing or self-reinforcing. The main question is how to stop this process, and which is more or less equivalent to the initial question that is the title of this talk: who will control the controller, who will control the government? The answer will be in the quantities that I have described before, for instance, in the degree of intolerance of citizens. Now I will introduce the dynamics. We denote by NC and NC the amount of corrupt and non-corrupt officials at a given moment in time, and as usual, when we introduce the replicated dynamics, we normalize it by N, so we have a percentage of corrupt officials following each one of the pure strategies, and we have the distribution of the officials over the set of pure strategies is given by that vector. In the same way, for the government, we have a mixed strategy for the government, and the replicated dynamics will be a dynamics for the percentage of corrupt officials and for the percentage of corrupt acts of the government. So the replicated dynamics are given by this. It's when the set of pure strategies has only two elements. The replicated dynamics are relatively simple. For instance, the derivative of NC, the percentage of corrupt officials according to time, is given by NC times 1 minus NC, which is just normalization. And then it's very simple. They compare the expected payoff of a corrupt strategy and the expected payoff of a non-corrupt strategy, and according to this will determine how the dynamics will evolve, and the same for the for the government, for the differential equation for the government. Since these are four differential equations, but only two of them are independent, so we'll work with the first and with the third, which are the important ones. So this is the simplified version of the previous system, where the quantities A, B, A prime, B prime are given by that, and those quantities, they reflect some characteristics of the society. I will describe them with greater detail in a moment. First, I will discuss the dynamical equilibrium and the Nash equilibrium of the model. And assuming that A and A prime are not zero, then we may have a dynamical equilibrium that is a mixed strategy, where that is inside the space that is the interesting space, the space where the system takes place, which is a square 0, 1. These are the mixed strategies. This is the mixed strategy, and when it is inside between 0 and 1, then this is a dynamical equilibrium of the system, and it is a mixed Nash equilibrium for the game. Now about the pure strategies that are also dynamical equilibrium, we have four of them. We gave them some names. The first one, it corresponds to a case where the strategy, the government follows a corrupt policy, and officials are also corrupt, and we called it the corruption bad equilibrium. On the other end, when the number of corrupt officials is 0 and the government doesn't follow a corrupt policy, we call it the non-corruption good equilibrium, which is the fourth equilibrium. And then there are two asymmetrical equilibria, that the first corresponds to a situation where officials are corrupt, government is not, and the other to the opposite situation. These are more difficult to interpret, but the interpretation that we found is more or less the following. The equilibrium 1-0 may be seen as a de facto government of the officials, where there is a small elite that the officials are the de facto government. On the opposite equilibrium, normally it's associated to a strong, corrupt, and usually autocratic elite that is highly repressive over the officials. One example, for instance, would be the third equilibrium is somehow parallel to a situation that occurred, for instance, in Portugal before 1974, where the corruption in Portugal between 1974. There was a highly developed censorship system that somehow cleaned the corruption from the citizens. Citizens did not have a perception, and corruption normally just occurred at the higher levels. Now, about the characteristics, the quantities that I've defined before, these quantities will play a very important role on the evolution of corruption in the long term. And the quantities, they may be interpreted in this way. B, the sign of the quantity B, characterizes the fines that the non-corrupt government practices. If it is less than 0, we say that the government practices inappropriate fines. If it is greater, we say that it practices appropriate fines. Quite similarly, for the quantity B prime, may be interpreted as the re-election power of a non-corrupt government. When it is less than 0, the non-corrupt government has a high re-election power. It may be due to several facts. For instance, it may be due to high intolerance of citizens to corruption. When citizens are sufficiently intolerant, then the non-corrupt government has a higher re-election power, and B prime may be negative. When they have not, then the quantity may be greater, may be positive, and in that situation, non-corrupt government has low re-election power. There are two more quantities. One is A plus B, that is the relative penalization between that a corrupt government puts in honest officials and dishonest officials. It's a comparison between those two punishes. And the last quantity that is relevant is A prime plus B prime, which is a measure of the efficiency of the non-corrupt government in fighting corruption. When it is positive, the government is efficient. When it is negative, the government is inefficient. Now I will describe some possibilities for the long-term behavior of the solutions of the dynamics according to this interpretation that I have given about the characteristics of the society. For instance, I start by considering a government as a society where a non-corrupt government has higher election power and there are appropriate fines, B prime less than 0, and B less than 0. When there is those two quantities are verified, A plus B greater than 0, A prime plus B prime greater than 0, then there are two asymptotically stable equilibria that correspond to the good and the bad equilibrium, as I described before. And there is also a mixed strategy, the one that I described before, that is a saddle point. And somehow it will separate between two different behaviors. I will show some picture in a moment. The social interpretation for this situation is, as I have described, is higher election power, appropriate fines, but the government is cost inefficient, and a corrupt government punishes honest behavior more than dishonest behavior because it wants to profit more. So now I'll show some pictures. The pictures are like this. These are two pictures. On the left side, we have a lower index of intolerance. On the right-hand side, we have a higher degree of intolerance. The initial conditions for the system are the same in the two pictures. What happens is that both equilibrium 0, 0 and 1, 1 are asymptotically stable. Some of the conditions on the picture on the left-hand side go to the 0, 0 equilibrium. Some go to the to the other one. In the second picture, in the right, there are still two asymptotically stable equilibrium, the same, but the index of intolerance has risen, and as a result, conditions that were originally on the basin of attraction of the bad equilibrium, 1, 1, are now on the basin of attraction with of the good equilibrium. So they now they now converge over time to the 0, 0 equilibrium. And the mixed strategy somehow is in the middle, and it separates between the two different regimes of dynamical behavior. No, this is what basically what I said before. The index of intolerance of citizens to corruption, if it is high enough, it may play. In this case, the previous picture illustrates that it plays an important role to control the government, to control corruption, and it acts as a barrier that stops corruption. Now, a different situation. When the government is, in the previous situation, the government was cost inefficient. If we change, if one of the inequalities changes, we obtain a corrupt government, a non-corrupt government that is cost efficient. And when it is cost efficient, then the long-term behavior will be convergence to the 0, 0 equilibrium. So in this case, all the interior initial conditions will converge to the 0-0 equilibrium. This corresponds to a well-ruled society. Then a third example. Now we change the B and the B prime. Now we have a situation when we have a non-corrupt government that has a low re-election power and inappropriate fines, and B greater than 0 and B prime greater than 0. When the government is cost inefficient in fighting corruption, then the only equilibrium that is asymptotically stable is the equilibrium that corresponds to 1-0. In this case, government has low re-election power, and in the long term, the government corruption will have very low levels, but the government is not able to control the officials, and the amount of corrupt behavior in the officials will be very high. Another example that is opposed to the one that I have shown before is a badly ruled society, when the only equilibrium that is asymptotically stable is the 1-1 equilibrium. In this case, the conditions are in the previous slide, the same as in the previous slide. The difference is that now the government is cost inefficient. Now about corruption cycles. In some situations, some cycles may appear. For instance, when B is less than 0 and B prime greater than 0, meaning inappropriate fines and high re-election power, low re-election power and inappropriate fines. So the interpretation might be like that. Low re-election power for a non-corrupt government incentives government corruption, an opportunity for profit, which then increases officials' corruption, as I have described before. And on the other end, if the government is also cost efficient, so it may be when the number of corrupt officials is very high, it may become profitable for the government to be less corrupt, because higher corruption lowers its chances of being maintained in power. Thus, officials' corruption, as a consequence, it lowers in response to the lowering of the government corruption, and because of the high fines that were practiced by the government, and the cycle resumes again. Now, some conclusions. We have these conclusions are mainly about the dynamics that I have described. There is a mixed interior equilibrium that may be a saddle point, or it may be a focus for periodic orbits. The focus that we have called corruption cycles, they arise when there is cost efficiency and high fines, but when the re-election power is low. Otherwise, the mixed equilibrium separates two regimes of behavior. One is between well-ruled society and badly ruled society, and the other one between officials, government, and autocratic elite corruption. I have not shown the picture for this last one. I've just shown the picture for the first, but the situation is quite similar. When the bad and good equilibrium are stable, then the other two pure asymmetrical equilibrium, they are not stable, and vice versa. When there are appropriate fines that are practiced by the government that has high re-election power, then only the good non-corruption equilibrium and the bad corruption equilibrium that may be stable. Those are the only equilibrium that may be stable. If the efficiency costs are very high, so efficiency is low, then both of equilibrium, the good and the bad, are unstable, and the country may be in a social trap of generally increasing levels of corruption depending on the picture that I have shown. Some of them are on the basis of attraction of the good equilibrium, some are on the basis of attraction of the bad equilibrium. And in this case, to overcome this social trap, this is where the index of intolerance of citizens to corruption makes an appearance, and where it is important, because it may change the basis of attraction of the equilibrium. When re-election power is low and fines are inappropriate, then the good non-corruption equilibrium is never stable. And when there are high penalties for corrupt officials by a corrupt government, then the equilibrium where government is corrupt and officials are honest is stable, and the last conclusion is that if the corruption index is not high enough, corruption can be self-sustaining, even if different elites alternate in power, for instance, in cycles of corruption. So when the corruption index is not high enough, we may be in the first situation with generally increasing levels of corruption, separating the two equilibrium, for a social trap, and in the second situation, it may also be a social trap, this time associated to cycles of corruption over time. So I think I finished. Thank you.